I could draw lines for hours, thin as silk, precise as a heartbeat. When I was drawing, the world stood still. Professors praised me, gallery owners admired me, even a museum once sent a letter. And then my brother came, carrying a box of papers and a tone that left no room for refusal. I drew everything: seals, signatures, IDs. A month later, he vanished, and 3 months after that, they came to me with a warrant. My gift had been my light and my sentence. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Joan Miller. I was 28 years old and lived in a modest second-floor apartment in a sleepy corner of Provo, Utah, where the mountains seemed to rise straight out of the pavement and the sky stretched wide like an empty canvas begging for color. I worked as an assistant archivist in the city library, not because it paid well or offered prestige, but because the silence suited me and the scent of paper reminded me of home. In the mornings, I cataloged municipal records, digitized old blueprints, and indexed dusty letters from the 1800s. By afternoon, I disappeared into the quiet hum of the stacks. But my real life began when I came home and locked the door behind me. My apartment was filled with paper, sketchbooks stacked like towers beside the couch, canvases leaning against the walls, bits of charcoal scattered across the floor like black petals. Every surface carried the remnants of a drawing, the ghost of a graphite smudge, the curl of a ripped edge, the faded trace of an abandoned idea. I lived alone, but the apartment never felt empty. My work breathed through the rooms like a quiet companion. I could lose hours drawing without realizing it. I called it falling through the page. I drew everything: birds on power lines, the reflection of sunlight in puddles, the way dust hovered in the afternoon light like suspended time. My drawings were not abstract, not political, not loud. They were precise, observant, almost too perfect. I had a hand for exactness, a hunger for detail. My professors used to call it dangerous realism. One of them said my talent bordered on forensic. I could copy any line, mimic any style, recreate any texture. Give me a fountain pen, and I could replicate a birth certificate from 1912 down to the pressure of the ink bleed. But I didn't think of my work that way. For me, it was about reverence, reverence for the world and its quiet complexity. I loved the grooves in tree bark, the geometry of stairwells, the curve of an eyelash caught in profile. It was never about showing off. It was about disappearing into the thing I was making, about capturing something so completely that it felt sacred. My mother used to say I could draw the sky into believing it was paper. She passed when I was 20, before she could see my work hang in galleries. Not the big ones, not yet, but enough to know I was on the path. The Utah Museum of Contemporary Art had shortlisted one of my sketches for a regional exhibit the year before. A gallery in Denver had expressed interest in my Water and Glass series. I was slowly becoming visible, not to the world at large, but to the small, tight-knit art circles that whispered names like secrets. I didn't party. I didn't date much. I didn't chase attention. My friends teased me for being too quiet, too careful, too precise. But precision was how I felt safe. My days were lines and order, clean corners, balanced light. The graphite never betrayed me. My older brother Trevor was the opposite. He was restless, impulsive, filled with a kinetic energy that made everyone in a room nervous without knowing why. He moved from job to job, city to city, always chasing some opportunity that hovered just out of reach. We hadn't spoken much in recent years. He called occasionally from numbers I didn't recognize, always promising he'd come visit, always asking if I was still doing that sketch thing. The last time I saw him before everything unraveled was 5 years earlier, when he showed up at our mother's funeral wearing sunglasses indoors and a suit that didn't fit. He left before the service ended. After that, he disappeared again, swallowed by the cracks in his own story. I wasn't angry, just tired. Some people float away, and you learn to let the rope go before it burns your hands. But I never forgot the way we were when we were kids, before the chaos, before life started cracking around the edges. He used to bring me comic books and tell me to copy the panels, said I could make a living drawing for Marvel someday. He believed in me in a way that no one else ever did. Maybe that's why, when he came back, I opened the door. It was mid-autumn, the kind of day where everything feels like it's on the verge of sleep. The sky was a dull sheet of gray. I was making tea, listening to old jazz on the radio, when the knock came. I almost didn't answer. I wasn't expecting anyone. But something in the rhythm, 3 soft knocks, evenly spaced, made me pause. I opened the door, and there he was, standing with a cardboard box in his arms and a look that said more than words ever could. He looked thinner, older, but his smile hadn't changed. That crooked, boyish grin that always preceded trouble. He stepped inside without asking. The box was heavy, and when he set it down, dust puffed into the air. He didn't say much, only that he needed help with something complicated. I didn't ask questions, not right away. Maybe I didn't want to know. Maybe I thought I could still pretend the world was a place where good intentions were enough. Later that night, after he had gone, I sat on the floor with the box open in front of me. Inside were folders, envelopes, old forms, copies of things that looked both familiar and not. There were signatures, stamps, photocopies of IDs. It was a puzzle I hadn't asked to solve, but my fingers were already reaching for the pieces. I didn't touch my sketchbook for the rest of the week. Something had shifted. The world tilted by a degree, enough that I felt it, even in sleep. My art no longer lived only in light and water. It now brushed against the edge of something darker, something not entirely mine. I should have walked away. I should have told him to take his box and his trouble and disappear again. But I didn't, because part of me still remembered the boy who watched me draw superheroes and said, "You're gonna change the world with those hands." And maybe, just maybe, I still wanted to believe him. The first time I drew on official paper, I hesitated. My hand hovered, the pen still capped, the line between curiosity and complicity drawn thinner than any I'd ever etched in graphite. It wasn't the kind of paper I was used to, the kind that absorbed intention and texture, the kind that gave itself willingly to art. This paper resisted. It was smooth and cold and sterile, the kind used for forms and bureaucracy, a vessel for declarations and permissions, not beauty, not truth, just function. Trevor had left me with a folder labeled with a name I didn't recognize and a note that simply said, "They just need a clean version." The folder contained a blurry scan of a driver's license, part of a tax return, and what looked like an employment verification letter that had clearly been tampered with. I told myself I wasn't doing anything illegal. I told myself I was just restoring clarity, cleaning up a document so that someone's life wouldn't fall apart because of a bad printer or a missing signature. I started with the letterhead. That was easy. I had a library of fonts in my head, and my hand could replicate spacing better than any software. I recreated the logo pixel by pixel. I adjusted the date, the name, the signature, and then, just like that, the paper looked whole again. I felt nothing, or maybe I felt too much to name. I shut the folder and placed it back in the box, like returning a relic to its shrine. But something lingered. The ghost of the page stayed on my fingers. My sketchbook felt foreign when I opened it that night. The trees I used to draw, delicate and tangled, no longer flowed from me. I closed it and pushed it under the bed. 2 days later, Trevor called from a burner number and asked if I could do another. He said it quickly, casually, like asking for a cup of coffee. This time it was a birth certificate. A woman from Venezuela who had lived in Salt Lake for 9 years, working under the table, raising 2 kids. She was applying for a special visa. She just needed the paperwork to back up a life she had already lived. That's how he said it. She just needs the paperwork to match the truth. I told myself I wasn't lying. I was just translating. I was giving people the documents they should have had in a world that wasn't so cruel. But I knew even then that truth doesn't come with stamps and signatures. It comes with risk. And mine was just beginning. That second job took longer. I had to match ink inconsistencies, mimic the slight fade of aged paper. I baked the final version in the oven on low heat to give it a touch of wear, then gently rubbed it with tea leaves to warm the tone. I studied samples online, government seals, line spacing, barcode placement. I wore gloves when I handled the finished document, not because I was afraid of fingerprints, but because it felt sacred and terrifying. I didn't charge anything. Trevor offered money, but I shook my head. I didn't want to be paid. As long as no money changed hands, I could still tell myself I was helping, that this wasn't crime, that this was just art in another form. But I was lying, and I knew it. Lies have a texture, and I felt it building under my skin like static. More folders came, more requests. Soon, it wasn't just people trying to stay in the country. It was small things. A high school diploma for a man who never graduated but wanted a job in another state. A forged landlord reference for a woman trying to escape an abusive partner. A medical clearance for someone trying to volunteer without the right insurance. None of it felt evil. In fact, most of it felt merciful. But mercy, I was learning, doesn't protect you from consequences. The work consumed me. I stopped sketching altogether. My easel became a table for sorting paper. My pencils dulled from disuse. My fingers adapted to the sleekness of counterfeit. I no longer dreamed of gallery walls or artist residencies. I dreamed in watermark patterns, in microprint, in ink density. I became obsessed with accuracy. If I was going to do it, I told myself, I would do it perfectly, because perfection to me was a kind of absolution. The more I perfected the craft, the more invisible I became. I didn't go out. I stopped returning calls. The woman at the grocery store stopped asking about my day. The librarian I used to have lunch with moved apartments. I didn't notice until a month later. I was erasing myself from my own life, one precise signature at a time. I started locking the windows, not out of paranoia, but to keep the world out. I didn't want anyone seeing what I was doing, not because I felt guilty, at least not exactly, but because I didn't want to answer questions I wasn't ready to ask myself. Questions like, when did I stop being an artist? When did I become a tool? When did the paper stop telling the truth? I stopped signing my name on anything. I paid in cash. I unsubscribed from newsletters. I deleted my portfolio website. I told myself I was protecting myself, but the truth was, I didn't want anyone to look at me and see what I had become. One night, I burned an old sketchbook, the one from college. I told myself it was because I needed space. But really, I couldn't stand the sight of the dreams inside it. Dreams drawn with the same hands that now forged licenses and approvals and letters that could get someone deported or saved, depending on who saw them. The smoke smelled like charcoal and regret. I watched the pages curl and blacken, and for the first time in months, I cried. Not because I was afraid, but because I missed myself. The girl who used to draw the sky. The woman who believed that art was something pure. She was still there, somewhere, but I had sealed her under layers of paper she couldn't breathe through. The work didn't stop. Trevor kept calling, always from new numbers, always with urgency. And I kept saying yes, even as my body said no. My heart beat too fast. My sleep came in fractured intervals. I began grinding my teeth so hard at night I cracked a molar. I ignored the pain. Pain was nothing new. I had lived with it quietly my whole life. Only now it had a sharper edge. I began to realize that the paper I worked on wasn't just official. It was dangerous. It held people's lives, their pasts, their futures. My hands had become gatekeepers. My talent, once meant for beauty, had become a tool for survival, not mine, theirs. But survival, I was learning, is a violent kind of beauty, and I didn't know how long I could keep painting it. It started as a tremor at the edge of my life, a vibration I could ignore if I kept my head down. But soon the tremor lived inside my hands. Every morning I woke to find them already curled into invisible lines, rehearsing signatures before I even touched a pen. My kitchen table had transformed from a place for coffee and toast into a command post. Folders stacked like towers, pens lined up like scalpels, stamps, rulers, magnifying glasses, scraps of reference paper, a lamp that burned long into the night. The air smelled faintly of ink, toner, and the kind of fear that clings to fabric no matter how many times you wash it. I worked in silence. No music, no television, no distractions. Only the sound of my own breathing and the scratch of nib on paper. Each new job demanded a different kind of intimacy. The names of strangers passed under my fingers, their birth dates, their histories, their imagined futures. I knew more about these people than I had ever known about my own neighbors. But they were only fragments, statistics wrapped in desperation. I was the unseen hand shaping the documents that could save or destroy them. My signature had become their lifeline. At first, I treated it like a craft. I studied microprint under a magnifier, traced watermarks against the window pane to match opacity. I experimented with pens, inks, and paper weights. I learned how to mimic the slight inconsistency of an aging hand, the way pressure varies across a line when a person is tired or rushed. Each forgery was a performance in empathy. I had to inhabit someone else's identity completely to make it real. But over time, the precision turned on me. The act of becoming so many other people made me lose hold of my own face. The smell of fear was real. It wasn't only mine. It clung to the envelopes that arrived at my door, to the handwritten notes Trevor left when he didn't want to call. People slipped their requests into manila folders like confessions into a church box. Some were neatly typed. Others were frantic scrawls with coffee stains and tears. I never met the clients, but sometimes I imagined their hands clutching the papers I made, how their breath must hitch when they crossed a border, opened a bank account, or handed over a card at a checkpoint. My work was meant to look like safety, but it carried the weight of danger. I began locking the door even when I was home. I taped over the peephole. The world outside became abstract, a muted blur behind curtains. My phone buzzed constantly with new numbers I didn't recognize. I stopped answering. Trevor left voicemails full of static and urgency. He always said it was the last time, the last job, the last person. I wanted to believe him, but another folder always came. At night, when the city outside grew quiet, the fear became louder. I lay awake listening to the refrigerator hum, to the neighbor's dog bark in its sleep, to my own heartbeat in my ears. I imagined sirens approaching, agents at my door, my apartment stripped bare, while gloved hands lifted my work into evidence bags. In dreams, my own signature appeared on warrants, confessions, indictments. I woke with ink-stained fingers even when I hadn't worked the night before. My reflection no longer looked like mine. The mirror above the bathroom sink showed a woman whose eyes had grown sharp and guarded, her jaw clenched even in sleep. My wrists were smudged with graphite, my nails bitten down. I avoided mirrors for days, sometimes weeks. When I caught sight of myself by accident, I flinched. I had become a shadow of the girl who once drew mountains and light. I lived inside the lines of other people's names. The money was still not mine. I stacked it in an old cookie tin under the bed. It wasn't greed driving me anymore, if it ever had been. It was obligation, momentum, a strange devotion to invisible strangers. Each check, each stamp felt like a prayer said without faith. My talent had become a kind of hunger, feeding on my days, erasing my nights. I noticed how my body began to echo my work. My handwriting outside the forgeries grew stiff, hesitant. I hesitated when signing my own name on bills, on packages, even on holiday cards. My signature started to change, as if it too had become counterfeit. I wondered which version was the real one, the one on my driver's license or the one I had perfected for someone else. Sometimes I caught myself practicing signatures I didn't need to write. My hand would move across scrap paper, sketching loops and flourishes, as if warming up for a performance I hadn't been asked to give. It scared me how automatic it felt, how natural. My fingers had learned their own language, one of deception disguised as precision. There were moments of clarity, small, fleeting ones, like when I found an old sketch between folders, an unfinished drawing of a woman's hands folded in prayer, done in soft pencil. I had drawn it years ago and forgotten. The sight of it made my chest ache. My hands trembled, not from fatigue, but from grief. For a moment, I felt the weight of every forged line pressing back at me, like the paper itself was breathing. But the work didn't stop. The fear didn't stop. It became a rhythm, a heartbeat, a metronome that guided my days. Wake up, lock the door, draw someone else's life, hide your own, repeat. The smell of ink became the smell of survival. The smell of survival became the smell of fear. And in the quietest hours, when my pen hovered above yet another signature, I could almost hear it, a faint whisper rising from the page, not words exactly, but the echo of all the names I had written. They clung to me like ghosts, crowding the small room, filling the air until it felt hard to breathe. I was surrounded by lives I had touched but never known, lives that might now be safer or might now be marked because of me. I kept working anyway, because by then the paper had become my only anchor, because stopping felt like falling, because somewhere deep inside I still believed that each signature, each perfect line, was a way of giving something back, even as it took more from me than I could ever repay. The signatures smelled like fear, yes, but they also smelled like me. It didn't happen with sirens. There were no sudden knocks, no dramatic shadows thrown across the windows at dawn. It happened quietly, like everything else in my life had. It began with a single envelope slipped under my door, cream-colored and without return address, its weight far heavier than paper should allow. The seal was broken when I found it. Inside, a folded page. No threats, no demands. Just a printed notice from a district office I had never heard of, referencing a case number and requesting my presence for clarification of activity related to financial documentation. My breath caught halfway between inhale and disbelief. I read it twice, then again. The words didn't change. The hallway outside was silent. The world kept spinning as if it didn't just tilt under my feet. That night I couldn't work. The tools lay on the table untouched. The lamp buzzed faintly, casting gold light across blank paper. But my hands wouldn't move. My body felt locked inside a moment too wide to escape. I opened the windows for the first time in weeks, letting in the late October air. It smelled like burning leaves and something older, like endings. I sat by the window until dawn, the letter on the table behind me, like a forgotten memory that refused to leave. A week later, they came. 2 agents. They weren't what I expected. No sunglasses, no cold formality. Just people. A man in a Navy windbreaker. A woman with kind eyes and a notepad. They didn't come in with force. They asked, and I let them. They moved through the apartment like curators in a gallery, pausing over stacks of paper, sketchbooks, old canvases that still leaned against the walls from another life. They didn't touch much, just looked. But their silence filled the room like floodwater. I watched them trace my work with their eyes, not the drawings I once made of trees and glass, but the forgeries, the simulations, the truths made false, and the lies made real. They didn't ask me many questions. Only one, really. Is this yours? The agent gestured to a file pulled from my desk. I nodded. That was all. No lies left to tell. No clever deflections. Only the bare, raw answer of someone who knew the ending had already arrived. I watched as they placed the file carefully into a box, alongside others. I wondered if they saw the same beauty I had once seen in the shapes of those letters, the way the ink curved with intention, the way a single line could mean safety or danger. When they left, I sat on the floor and stared at the empty spaces where the folders had been. The air felt lighter and heavier all at once. A storm had passed through without thunder, and everything it touched had turned to evidence. The next day, I was summoned to a small municipal office, tucked between a dry cleaner and a medical supply store. The building was quiet, sterile, the kind of place where the air conditioner hums too loud and the carpet never quite loses the smell of bleach. I sat in a room with pale green walls and a single framed print of a mountain landscape. It looked fake, too clean, too bright. I wondered if someone had forged it too, and if so, whether they'd felt the same ache I did now. A woman walked in carrying a box. She placed it on the table between us and opened the lid. My stomach tightened. Inside were my drawings, not the ones from my gallery submissions or art school finals. These were the others, the ones made in quiet desperation. A passport, a birth certificate, a diploma with an embossed seal I'd recreated from memory, each one placed carefully in a transparent sleeve, organized, cataloged. She slid the first file toward me. This was used in a federal employment case, she said. Her voice wasn't cold. It wasn't warm either. It was neutral, as if it had been scrubbed of personal judgment. We'd like to talk about your process. I stared at the document. My hand had drawn it, every curve, every line. I could see the pressure shifts in the ink, the subtle irregularities I had built in on purpose to mimic human imperfection, to make it real, to make it believable. And it was, too believable. That was the problem. They asked me about technique, about tools, about how I had learned to copy so exactly. I spoke without looking up. My voice felt detached from my body. I heard myself describe the layering of watermarks, the drying time for different inks, how I practiced certain state seals dozens of times before attempting the final version. I spoke like an artist, because I was, still, somehow, even in this fluorescent lit room, surrounded by copies of crimes. When I left, I felt hollowed out, as if every word had cost me more than I could afford. I walked home under a sky the color of wet concrete, the streets slick with the first spit of rain. My coat clung to me, heavy with moisture. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in months, maybe longer. Weeks passed. I didn't hear anything. But I knew they were building a case, compiling, measuring, weighing. I imagined my work laid out on tables, agents leaning over them with latex gloves, dissecting each letter, each forged date, each simulated past. I imagined them hanging on walls in some federal office, not as art, but as exhibits, pieces of a puzzle whose center was my name. And then, one morning, I received a formal notice, charges pending, preliminary hearing scheduled. The language was clinical, indifferent, but it cut deeper than any critique I had ever received in art school. This was no longer about style or technique. This was about who I had become. That night, I opened a sketchbook for the first time in what felt like years. I tried to draw, just a line, just something. But my hand hovered, empty. The pencil felt foreign. The page rejected me. My own canvas had become hostile. I closed it again and placed it gently on the shelf, like a relic. I wasn't ready to touch it. Maybe I never would be. The apartment felt smaller after that, as if it too had been marked. The walls whispered with memory, each drawer a drawer of ghosts. I moved slowly, deliberately, like I was trying not to disturb the dust of my own undoing. I dreamed of galleries, real ones, lit with soft halogens, white walls, silence, people leaning in to admire the precision of a line, the intimacy of a stroke. I used to imagine my name on the wall, small and clean in black font, beside a frame that held something I made with love. Now, my work would be displayed under glass for a very different reason. Still admired, maybe, still praised even, but for skill, not for soul. A gallery of evidence, a museum of betrayal, and every piece in it signed by my hand. The courthouse looked like every government building I had ever walked past without seeing. Square, gray, indifferent. The flag out front sagged in the dry morning air, the sky above it pale and indecisive. I arrived early, too early. The streets were still waking up, but my nerves had been awake all night. I hadn't slept. I sat on the steps for a while before walking through the heavy double doors, my hands clenched in the sleeves of my coat, my breath shallow and slow, like I was afraid of waking something inside me that couldn't be put back to sleep. The hallway inside smelled like paper and waxed tile. I followed the signs like a tourist in a museum built to honor consequence. My boots echoed too loudly on the floor. Every turn felt final. Every closed door looked like it might open onto my ruin. At the security checkpoint, a guard asked me to empty my bag. I laid it out slowly: wallet, keys, a folded tissue, the small black pen I always carried out of habit, as if I might suddenly need to sketch the world into something gentler. Courtroom 3B was down the hall, left, then right. The door was already ajar. I could hear voices, shuffling, the soft murmur of paper being passed between hands. I stood there for a moment before stepping inside. The room was colder than the hall. The lights buzzed faintly. There were no windows. Rows of benches faced the front, where the judge's bench rose slightly, a throne of carved wood and formality. To the right sat the prosecution. To the left, my lawyer, a quiet man with rimless glasses and an expression that looked like it had seen too many lives folded into too many files. I took my seat beside him. My palms were slick. I folded them in my lap. The judge entered. Everyone stood. I stood too, though I barely felt my legs. The room shifted from murmur to silence in a breath. And just like that, the play began. It was a strange kind of theater, one without costumes or music, but with its own choreography, its own monologues, its own quiet audience. The prosecutor stood and recited the facts like he was reading stage directions. My name, my age, my occupation, former now. Then the charges: forgery, falsification of government records, identity fraud, aiding and abetting. The words fell like stones into water. No reaction, no emotion, just facts, cold and measured. He described the evidence with clinical precision: documents, seals, signatures, over 30 files, each one matched to a record. Some had already been used in legal proceedings. One had surfaced in an immigration audit. Another had led to a denial of benefits. It wasn't just paper, he said. It was identity. It was trust. It was law rewritten by ink that had no right to speak. I didn't look at him. I stared at my hands, at the pale lines in my knuckles, at the faint smudge of ink under my thumbnail that refused to scrub out completely. My hands looked like they belonged to someone else now, someone careful, someone dangerous. Then came my lawyer. His voice was low and even. He didn't deny the facts. He acknowledged them, but he framed them differently. He spoke of intention, of desperation, of care misplaced. He talked about Trevor without naming him directly, about obligation, about family, about the slow corrosion of choice when fear becomes the air you breathe. He held up one of the forged documents, a diploma, not a real one, but one I had made so precisely that even I had to squint to tell it from the genuine article. He said it wasn't made for profit, that it wasn't sold, that it was used to help a woman get a job cleaning hotel rooms so she could keep her children fed. He said my hands had done wrong, but that they had also done good. I kept waiting for someone to speak directly to me, to ask me why, to ask me how it felt. But the court wasn't interested in emotion. It was only interested in sequence and result, in what could be proven and what could be punished. When the judge finally looked at me, I met his gaze and held it. He asked if I understood the charges. I said yes. He asked if I wished to make a statement. I stood. My legs trembled slightly. I placed both hands on the edge of the table to steady myself. The room was quiet. Everyone watched. I didn't try to explain everything. There was no time, and maybe no point. But I said this: that I had a gift once, that it was meant for beauty, that I used it, and it took me somewhere I never expected, that I never imagined paper could ruin a life, that I had made decisions I would carry with me longer than any sentence he could impose, that I wasn't asking for mercy, only acknowledgement that it had come from something that started as love, that sometimes love turns into something unrecognizable when it's afraid. When I finished, the silence in the room felt different, not forgiving, not sympathetic, just heavier. The judge nodded once. Then he read the sentence: 18 months, suspended conditional probation, a fine, community service, mandatory counseling, a felony on my record, no prison, but no erasure either, no forgetting. I sat back down slowly, my vision tunneling at the edges. The courtroom blurred. My breath came in shallow, careful doses. I had expected worse. I had prepared for bars, for chains, for cells, but the weight of being named, labeled, judged, filed away, felt just as binding. The bailiff gestured to the door. It was over. Outside, the sun had risen higher. People walked past the courthouse with coffee cups and car keys, arguing about traffic, checking their phones. The world hadn't changed. Only I had. I stood on the steps for a long time, watching the city move around me like a current I no longer knew how to swim in. Court is not about justice, not always. It is about order, about performance, about the ritual of declaring someone seen, named, and placed. I had been placed, and somewhere inside me, the part that once drew light onto paper folded in on itself like a closing hand. The show was over, but the stage was still inside me. Freedom didn't come as a grand return. It came like fog, slow and shapeless, drifting in through the cracks of a life I no longer recognized. There were no reunions, no celebrations, just the quiet creak of the front door closing behind me and the thick, unmoving air of my apartment, a space that once held purpose, now swollen with dust and silence. The first thing I noticed was the way everything smelled. Paper gone stale, old graphite, forgotten tea leaves. My sketchbooks were still stacked where I'd left them, undisturbed. My easel stood in the corner, draped with a cloth that had long since grayed. I touched it gently, like waking something delicate, and felt the fabric collapse under my fingers. My brushes, too, sat on the shelf, hardened at the tips, their handles sticky with time. They looked like tools from another life. I didn't draw. I cleaned instead, scrubbed the bathroom tiles, threw out food long expired, swept the dust from beneath the fridge, wiped fingerprints from the windows. I boxed up folders I couldn't bear to look at, labeled them with thick, permanent marker: old, storage, do not open. I didn't throw them away. I couldn't. I told myself it was for legal reasons, for accountability. But the truth was simpler. I needed them to exist somewhere outside my hands. I walked the neighborhood in the mornings, hood up, face turned toward the sidewalk. The world seemed too bright, too loud. I felt like a ghost, trailing behind lives still in motion. People didn't look at me twice. No one knew. But I did. Every time I passed a bank, I remembered the counterfeit checks. Every time I walked by the post office, I remembered envelopes with other people's names in my handwriting. Every mailbox looked like a confessional. The worst of it wasn't fear. It was the emptiness, the way each hour stretched, unfilled. For so long, I had lived inside the pressure of creation, the urgency of replication, the heat of deadlines and risk. Now, nothing demanded my hand, nothing called to be forged, or drawn, or made. I would sit at the table and stare at my fingers as if they were strangers. These were the hands that once shaped light and shadow, that once knew how to pull soul out of paper. Now they twitched for no reason and stayed still when I begged them to move. I tried to draw once. It was raining. I lit a candle and opened a fresh sketchbook. The page felt too clean, too judgmental. I held my pencil loosely, pressed it to the paper, and waited for something to emerge. A shape, a line, anything. But the mark came crooked, uncertain, thin with hesitation. I tried again. My hand cramped. My breath hitched. I ripped the page out and threw it away. The sound of the tear echoed through the room like an accusation. It wasn't just that I had forgotten how to draw. It was that drawing no longer felt safe. It felt like the beginning of something that could spiral. I didn't trust myself with beauty, not after what I had turned it into. I applied for jobs, quiet ones, data entry, warehouse inventory, grocery stocker. No interviews. A felony follows you like smoke, even when the fire's out. I volunteered at a food pantry, sorting donations in the back where no one asked questions. I kept my head down. I showed up on time. I didn't speak unless spoken to. Sometimes, the women there would hand me little notes to transcribe, messages to friends, family, short letters in broken English. I rewrote them neatly, carefully, trying not to fall in love with the lines, trying not to turn letters into art. I saw Trevor once, briefly. He didn't come to the courthouse, didn't write, but he called from a blocked number and left a voicemail. He said he was sorry, that he didn't know it would get so big, that he hoped I was okay. I deleted the message, not out of anger, but because I had nothing left to say. Some threads can't be tied back together. Some silence becomes permanent. Winter came early that year. The city folded into itself. I watched the snow build on the windowsill and thought about how blankness can sometimes be a mercy. I started taking long walks in the evening when the streets emptied. I passed art supply stores but didn't go in. I looked at the paintings in coffee shop windows but didn't stop. The color made my chest tighten. Then, one day, I saw a flyer pinned to the bus stop shelter. Volunteers needed. Art classes at a shelter for women. No experience required. Materials provided. I stared at it for a long time. It looked hand-drawn. The letters uneven, almost shy. I didn't take the number, not that day, but I came back the next. The building was old, the paint flaking around the windows. Inside, the floors creaked with every step. The room was small, just a few tables, some chairs, a bin of broken pastels, and used sketch pads. The women came in slowly, hesitantly. Some barely spoke. Others laughed too loudly. I didn't talk about myself. I said my name was Joan, that I was here to help with hands and lines, and maybe, if they wanted, with color. We didn't draw flowers or houses or smiling suns. We drew hands, eyes. We smudged shadows with fingertips. We broke crayons and called it technique. One woman, Carmen, drew a tree with roots that reached off the page. Another, Lena, drew a storm cloud above a cityscape and colored it gold. I didn't correct them. I didn't guide. I just watched. I began to draw again, slowly, quietly, not in my apartment, not alone, but there, in that room filled with grief and noise and survival. I let myself press charcoal to paper and let the smudge stay. I didn't erase. I didn't try to be perfect. I let the line tremble. My drawings changed. They weren't precise anymore. They weren't about replication or beauty. They were about presence, about proof that I was here, that I had something left to give. Freedom isn't what I thought it would be. It isn't clean. It doesn't come with applause. It comes with stillness, with time, with empty spaces that wait for something real. I don't hold the pen the way I used to. I don't try to impress the page. I let it press back. And even if my name never hangs on a gallery wall, even if no one ever calls me artist again, I still draw. Because some lines can't be erased, only rewritten, carefully, honestly, and this time in my own name.